Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host, Omar Khalid. But today is the 20th of June, 2022. These are the stories that we'll be discussing during the course of the show. We'll begin with the latest as far as the Ukraine situation is concerned, whether it be the Ukrainian president that expects Russia attacks to intensify with the EU summit this week, whether it be the desire of Ukraine to enter as part of the European Union, and also the affirmation by the European Union that Ukraine will indeed become a part of European Union. Will that affect the current state of the crisis of the war between Russia and Ukraine? A lot of analysts say that this crisis, this war is going to continue for not a couple of weeks, for not a couple of months, but even more than that. What impact is it going to have as far as food security, as far as economy, as far as politics, as far as geostrategy of the region is concerned? This is going to be our first segment. Our second story, ladies and gentlemen, concerns the World Refugees Day that is being celebrated today. That is the 20th of June. Since 2000, the world comes together to celebrate the World Refugee Day. Now, when it comes to Pakistan, we know the amount of Afghan refugees that Pakistan has been hosting since the last few decades. And we also see that with the current crisis in Afghanistan, that number is not decreasing, but in fact is going to increase and is increasing as well. Nobody wants to go back to Afghanistan as far as the current situation in our neighboring countries is concerned. What kind of impact is it going to have on Pakistan? What kind of impact is it going to have on the refugees that are present here in Pakistan and elsewhere across the world as well as far as refugees are concerned? This is going to be our second story of the day. Then we'll be talking about COVID-19 cases that are again on the rise as far as Pakistan is concerned. Although the percentage is less than 2% for the moment, but there have been casualties, there are cases, and the number is slowly and steadily increasing. The percentage was 3% a couple of days back. Now it has decreased. Nevertheless, the importance of following the SoPs becomes even more paramount now, because not only does it help people not get the disease, but also help it from being disseminated amongst the public. Then our last story, ladies and gentlemen, concerns Sri Lanka, whose military has opened fire to contain rioting at a fuel station. We know the current crisis that Sri Lanka is going through as far as its economy is concerned. It has defaulted on its external loans, and the IMF is trying to help, but it has still not come to the stage where the money has reached Sri Lanka. What is happening is that there are unprecedented queues for petrol and diesel across the bankrupt country, and this is creating havoc. A lot of people are protesting. A lot of people want some kind of solution to this current crisis that Sri Lanka is embroiled with, its biggest crisis since it became independent. Let's begin this segment, today's newsroom, with the first story, and that concerns the crisis that has engulfed, in fact, Ukraine since the last more than 100 days, and Russia as well. But not only Ukraine and Russia, in fact, it's the countries across the region and in the world also that are directly or indirectly affected by it. More in the following report.
As the Russia-Ukraine war enters its 117th day, Ukraine's president is expecting escalation of hostilities this week as Kiev awaits an European Union decision on its candidate status. Ukraine applied to join the 27-nation European Union 4 days after start of direct confrontation with Russia across its border in February. Russian President Putin elaborated that Moscow had nothing against Ukraine's European Union membership, but a Kremlin spokesperson said Russia is closely following Kiev's bid, especially in light of increased defense cooperation. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, is confident Ukraine will be granted official candidate status ahead of a key European Union summit in Brussels later this month. Underlining bleak dynamics of Ukraine crisis, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the war in Ukraine could take years and the West must continue its support of Ukraine. Ukraine war is preventing grain from leaving the breadbasket of the world and making food more expensive across the globe, threatening to worsen shortages, hunger, and political instability in developing countries. Russia and Ukraine export nearly a third of the world's wheat and barley, more than 70% of its sunflower oil, and are big suppliers of corn. The current spike in global inflation and market meltdown depicts economic consequence of Ukraine conflict and illustrates urgency of dialogue and diplomacy.
Now, as far as the latest details concerning this crisis between Ukraine and Russia, this war situation that is not only engulfing Russia and Ukraine, but also the countries indirectly around it and the developing countries, because of the shortage of food, because of the shortage of grain, and it is creating slowly and steadily a huge crisis, especially as far as food is concerned, as far as economy is concerned, as far as gas, petrol are concerned. To talk more about this, we've been joined by Ali Mustafa. He's a correspondent from the Turkish channel TRT World. Ali, thank you very much to have joined us. Ali, when you look at this current crisis that has engulfed Russia, Ukraine, and the countries nearby as well, when you look at the food crisis, let's start with the food crisis. The EU's top diplomat says Russia's blockade of Ukrainian imports that it alleges is being blocked by Russia is preventing grain exports, fueling fears of a global food crisis, and it amounts to a war crime. How much of that, A, is true, and B, if it is true, what can be done to alleviate it?
Well, if you just look at the numbers, Ukraine, before this war, was exporting between 25 to 30% of the world's grain supplies. Sunflower oil, through some estimates, Ukraine was exporting 50 to 57% of the global sunflower oil exports. And Russia, on the other hand, is one of the biggest producers of fertilizer in the world. It also produces a lot of wheat and grain. What this means is that because of war and because of Ukrainian ports, Odessa primarily, other ports have been absorbed by the Russians in Crimea, in the Azov Sea. The Black Sea ports of Odessa are still in the hands of the Ukrainians, but they are effectively blockaded due to Russian mines. And as a result of this, the sea route for all these supplies has been blocked, unless, of course, you're a Russian ship that is allegedly appropriating Ukrainian commodities and supplies and then shipping them down the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus, through the Dardanelles and into the Mediterranean, then taking them to Syria and so on and so forth. So it's a huge issue, and especially when it comes to entities like the United Nations World Food Programme, because the WFP was purchasing up to 50% of its wheat, for example, from Ukraine to supply to Africa, to supply to other parts of the world which are drought-stricken, for example. And because this supply has been hindered, it's not completely stopped because Ukraine is still exporting or sending supplies through its western borders, through Poland, Romania, and so on and so forth. But the quickest way for these supplies to reach the world market or to places in need is by the sea. And because that is completely at a standstill, in the next few months, as the summer months progress and you approach fall, you'll be looking at a severe disaster, so to speak.
All right, when it comes to Ukraine, Ali, we see the complete backing by the European Union. We also see the desire of Ukraine to become part of the European Union. We've seen a lot of positivity emanate in the last few statements that have come from the European Union. On the same side, Ukraine also says the same. Russia isn't against it, but it said it says that the European Union needs to be cautious as far as making Ukraine part of the European Union is concerned as well. When it comes to crises such as this food crisis, that is not only, affecting Ukraine, Russia and the countries, but it is also affecting all the developing countries and other countries in the West and also countries such as Pakistan. Do you see any end in sight? Do you see some kind of a negotiation or some kind of a process that might result in this food being exported out to the countries that deserve it the most?
Well, you do have some sort of diplomatic effort being fronted by Turkey, which has been speaking to Russia without the involvement of Ukraine in the past few weeks to try to open up Odessa so that Ukraine is able to export its wheat supplies, other essentials. But the sticking point here is, from the Ukrainian side, one reason they don't want to be part of this process is because they accuse Russia of stealing Ukrainian wheat, of stealing Ukrainian grains, and of basically using the ports that it controls to smuggle all these supplies out of Ukraine and into the world market, into Russian-controlled markets or markets where Russia is dominant. And they say because of this theft, they will not negotiate with the Russians on easing of any blockades. They said that this should be an international effort, that what Russia is doing is in effect a criminal enterprise when it comes to smuggling and illegally stealing, according to the Ukrainians, supplies that it essentially owns or has produced but have fallen into the hands of the Russians.
All right. Now, Ali, also looking at the economy of the world and how it's being impacted from another angle, and let's talk about gas and oil that is also being hindered because of this whole crisis that is affecting the relationship between the European Union and Russia. Russia is, there are a lot of sanctions that have been put by the European Union as far as Russian oil and gas is concerned. Nevertheless, there are countries in the European Union that are still importing Russian gas and oil, and there are countries that say that Russia is not supplying them with the necessary percentage of gas and oil that is needed. At the same time, there is also Hungary, and Russia promises to continue the gas shipments to that country because there is a stronger relationship between Hungary and Russia as well. Where do you see all of this going? I'm talking specifically about the oil and gas crisis.
Well, Hungary under Viktor Orban is indeed part of the Russian sphere, so to speak. But in Germany, they're talking about reactivating coal run plants from about 20 years ago because they're anticipating it to be an extremely cold winter. Russia, in some instances, was supplying up to 60% of gas needs for these countries, especially during the winter months. And still, Russia is selling about €1 billion a day. 1 billion euros a day worth of energy to Europe since it attacked Ukraine on the 24th of February. So it's very difficult for any country or any group of countries to completely disconnect from Russian gas and oil. And as they try to do so, there are other opportunities. For example, we're getting reports that China has imported copious amounts of Russian oil and gas. The Indians have imported up to 9 times as much oil and energy resources from Russia in the past 4 months that they did in the previous 12 months. So it goes to show that, yes, while some countries might ostracize Russia, there are opportunities that other countries will be willing to exploit. But when it comes specifically to Europe and European efforts, keep in mind the German Chancellor Scholz was here in Kiev just a few days ago, trying to show support for Ukraine. So was the French President Emmanuel Macron. But when it comes to domestic politics and how this plays out on domestic economies across Europe, especially the biggest economies, arguably, Germany and France, it's going to be very bad for them.
All right, when you talk of the political impact, Ali, you know that Macron has had a defeat as far as his popularity in France is concerned very recently. Do you feel that the political impact of the crisis that is not only engulfing the countries, but more are the people of those countries that are being impacted? When the people decide to vote against the powers that be, is it going to create a political turmoil within the European Union as a result of this crisis as well? Do you foresee that?
It's interesting you mentioned Macron and Marine Le Pen. Keep in mind that Macron narrowly defeated Marine Le Pen just a few months ago in a closely fought presidential election. And one of the things that he was accusing Marine Le Pen of was of being very close to Vladimir Putin. We've seen over the past few months that Macron himself has had many conversations with Putin. He's been accused of trying to give Putin, quote, an off-ramp, so to speak. So definitely, because the Russians, through their vast network of disinformation, propaganda, websites that they run, have been fueling certain political movements inside Europe, in Germany, in France, and elsewhere that talk about European independence, that talk about Fortress Europe, that are affiliated in some cases with far-right movements in this country. So that results in a divided polity and eventually a polity where the far right, for example, like in France, is on the rise.
That is so true, and I think that is going to have a direct impact as far as the politics of the countries in the European Union are concerned. What about the countries that are taking advantage of this situation from Russia, for example, China, for example, India? Do you feel they will be ostracized or put on the side? We understand, I've just read that Japan is trying to hold a meeting of important countries on the sidelines of NATO to pressurize China as well. Do you feel India could also come under such pressure because it is buying more and more oil from Russia?
What the war in Ukraine or Russia's attack in Ukraine has shown is that diplomacy doesn't work on a globalist agenda. It's actually quite compartmentalized. So, for example, and this is something that Russia is a master at over the past few years, you can fight with Russia, you can fight against Russia, but then you have to deal with Russia in certain instances as well. And India is a perfect example. It's the world's largest free market-based economy. It is an ally with the Americans when it comes to the Quad, but it buys copious amounts of fuel, weapons, and other things from Russia, and the Americans have to live with it. When it comes to China, China is the US's biggest trading partner, still, despite all the tensions and the American pivot to the east, to the Pacific, so to speak. But at the same time, these are global players. They have their own priorities, and their interests depend or keep changing depending on the situation or the circumstance at any given moment. They're not, when it, at least in the international arena, they're not pegged to an ideology or a group of people. For them, wherever the opportunity takes their country, they will associate. When the same comes for Russia. Russia might look like it's down and out, but when it comes to the amount of gains it has made over the past few months, it's on the up.
All right, but there are a lot of statements that have emanated from Russia that Russian economy is being impacted, and it is going to be impacted on a very long term as a result of this crisis. Now, when it comes to the way out of this crisis, the only way possible that a lot of people talk about is a negotiated process, is talks. There have been 2 rounds of talks between the 2 sides. The second round of talks seem to be more optimistic, but nothing tangible has come out of it. Now, if I quote the former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, he says Moscow should not negotiate with Washington on nuclear disarmament until the United States crawls back to talks. This is just one aspect of it, nuclear disarmament. Then there is Zelensky, who also says that Russia is going to increase its warfare in Ukraine before Ukraine becomes officially part of the European Union. A, there's an apprehension from the side of Ukraine. B, we see the impact that is in Ukraine as far as the casualties are concerned. C, do you see any kind of a future in as far as negotiated process is concerned? Do you see the willingness from Russia or from Ukraine to sit down for talks to come to some kind of a solution?
Negotiated processes can continue, but so can fighting and war. And we've seen Russia and how it operates. It'll support negotiations incrementally, but after, for example, this country just didn't or wasn't just attacked 4 months ago. This country was attacked the first time in 2014.
True.
And when Russia took over Crimea, parts of Donetsk and Luhansk and so on and so forth. But going back to an earlier point that you made, Iran and American nuclear talks, or talks to return back to the so-called JCPO agreement that Obama and the Iranian regime got into, and then Trump got rid of it. In the latest round of Biden administration and Iranian government talks, the Russians have played a significant role. This is something that we don't advertise, but if the Americans and the Iranians do reach an agreement on Iran or curbing Iran's nuclear program or restarting those curbs, benefit of that will also go towards the Russians. So it goes to show that if you go beyond the words and the rhetoric, the situation is a lot more complicated and a lot more entangled than we like to think.
So what you mean to say, Ali, is that the implication of this crisis in Ukraine is not just for Russia, Ukraine, food, or oil or gas, but it also goes beyond that. It also goes to impact agreements such as the JCPOA and the future of JCPOA. Is that right?
It absolutely does, but while it also hurts Russia, it doesn't necessarily play into the hands of the opposing side, the Americans and the Europeans, because what it reveals is that despite trying to ostracize or corner Russia, Russia is far more involved politically, militarily, or economically in how the world runs than as opposed to how the Americans or the Europeans would like to think it is.
All right. Finally, Ali, I've taken a lot of your time, and thank you very much for that. This war between Russia and Ukraine that has led to weaponization of Ukraine from different countries in the West, and this continuation of weaponization. A, the impact of this weaponization in the long term. B, the study by this think tank, Study of War, which is a Washington-based think tank, writes that Russian forces are likely to be able to seize some areas in Ukraine in the coming weeks, but they also say that this war could run for many years. If this war continues to run for more than a year or more than a couple of years, what impact is it going to have on Russia, Ukraine, and the countries surrounding it?
You don't put out a wildfire by putting more fuel on it or dry wood. sending weapons or $40 billion worth of American weapons, money that isn't going to go directly to the Ukrainians, is going to be sourced through American defense contractors, will act like adding fuel to a wildfire that was started by the Russians. What ends up happening in a situation like that is that the emergence of militarized states, where pockets of militias control parts of the country because they're in an active conflict with the other part. And if these militias or these armed groups are then supplied with sophisticated weaponry, even if it isn't as much as was promised, what it does, it becomes a testing ground for weapons, as we saw the Russians in Syria tested some of their biggest weapons there. Even in Ukraine, the Russians have tried to test new weapons, even though the symbol of their losses in Kiev has been the T-72 burnt out tanks, destroyed tanks. But on the other side, you have the javelins, for example, that are making a comeback, or manpads, so to speak, like the Stinger missiles. So if America, or if all sides are saying, for example, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, just 48 hours ago said this war will continue for years. These are commonsensical conclusions because you're expecting the arrival of even more heavy weapons and a militarized state moving forward in Ukraine.
All right. So the impact is going to be disastrous if this continues for more than a year, not only on Ukraine, not only on Russia, but also on all the countries that are surrounding it, and including the West. Thank you so very much, Ali Mustafa, correspondent TRT World, who have joined us, who have talked to us about the latest details as far as this war between Russia and Ukraine is concerned, whether it is impacting the countries across it, whether it is impacting the developing countries in particular in the West because of the food crisis, because of the oil and gas crisis, but also because of the strategic impact that this crisis is going to have, not only in the short term but also in the long term. Let's come to our second article, and that concerns the World Refugees Day that is being celebrated today. Since 2000, the world has come together to celebrate this very important day. The impact of refugees on a host country is consequential in the short term and in the long term. More in the following report.
The World Refugee Day is being observed today to honor the courage, strength and determination of refugees who are forced to flee their homeland under threat of persecution, conflict and violence. The theme of the World Refugee Day is Seeking Safety is a Human Right, which aims to build empathy and understanding for the plight of refugees and recognize their resilience in rebuilding their lives. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees survey in 2021, over 26.6 million refugees exist in the world at the moment. The number is expected to grow as geopolitical conflicts in Africa and Europe displace countless others. To spread awareness about the issues refugees face worldwide, the United Nations recognized June 20th as World Refugee Day. Despite several socio-economic and security challenges, Pakistan is hosting the second largest refugee population of almost 3 million Afghans. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has urged the world community to help developing countries who continue to host large number of refugees. Foreign Office spokesperson Asim Iftikhar stated that a renewed international commitment is need of the hour to provide adequate financing for Afghan refugees, including their safe and dignified return. Pakistan's solidarity and compassion for hosting Afghan refugees is a remarkable blueprint that the rest of the world could follow.
Brigadier Retired Saad Mohammed, who's an analyst, joins us online. Brigadier Saab, thank you very much to have joined us. Brigadier Saab, the World Refugees Day, when you look at it, when you understand what it means, the impact is not only on the refugees that change their home ground, their home country and go to another country, but also on the country that hosts it. When we look at the current situation across the world and with specific reference to Pakistan, what kind of future do you see as far as refugees are concerned or refugee hosting countries are concerned?
First of all, the world needs to recognize that Pakistan today holds the world's largest refugee population. And it's not a country which has got a lot of, resources to look after these refugees. After the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, the world just forgot about the Afghan war and they just packed up. All the NGOs packed up, everybody went away and left the entire refugee problem and the Afghan problem to Pakistan. But Pakistan has done remarkably well that it has hosted these refugees despite the severe economic hardships that the country is facing and it continues to face. So that the world has failed to recognize. Now, the refugee problem in the world, you will see that, the wars that have been imposed, the unnecessary wars, senseless wars that have been imposed in various parts of the world, they have created a huge refugee problem. And there is the UNHCR, I don't think so it has got the resources or it has got the skills to look after such a vast, group of people who have been forced to leave their homeland because of the wars. If you look at Iraq and if you look at Syria and to Libya, to Afghanistan.
And even in Ukraine, sir,
crisis,
there are so many refugees that have left Ukraine and have gone to the West. So there is also that refugee influx inside the West, inside the European Union as we speak.
Yes, there are, but it is of no match to what Pakistan is doing. Now,
Yes,
all the
of course,
countries,
nothing compared to what Pakistan is doing as far as refugees is concerned.
The European countries are very rich and they have the resources to look after the refugees, and they are partly responsible for the war that was created in the Ukraine. They have to share some of the responsibility of the war that is now going on, and they say that it's going to go on for quite some time. Now, in Afghanistan, Pakistan didn't have any role for the Soviet troops to come into Afghanistan, and subsequently when the Americans also, started helping the Mujahideen to overcome the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. So Pakistan does not have that much of blame to share, but it has got the maximum, the fallback or the backlash of the refugees has come on Pakistan. Now, at the peak of the Afghan war, there were over 5 million refugees in Pakistan. And that creates a huge environmental impact. It destroyed the complete environment of Pakistan. Forests were cut. The jobs had to be provided. And there are so many other effects which we are going to see for centuries affecting Pakistan.
But Brigadier Sir, when you look at this long-term impact or short-term impact, but for Pakistan it's a long-term impact because as we speak since 2020, there are around 1.4 million official registered Afghan refugees, and I don't know how many unregistered Afghan refugees inside of Pakistan, inside the different regions of our country. You said the world has kind of forgotten about this whole refugee crisis that Pakistan has been facing since the last few decades. What needs to be done by Pakistan in order to make the world, in order to make United States or other Western countries realize that they need to help make Pakistan deal with such an important crisis?
Pakistan requires economic assistance to look after such a large refugee population. Most of them are, in the local job market, and they're taking on the jobs of the Pakistanis. And so many Pakistanis get out of work because there are Afghans who are prepared to do that very work for less amount of wages. So that impacts the Pakistani people also in that way. So the West would do it. But would I be making any wishful sort of demands from the West? Because, they go by their interests. When they had interest in Afghan twice, we have seen in the last 4 decades that they have had interest in Afghanistan. They came with huge and massive economic aid and they tried to help us out. But the moment they saw that, their objectives were, obtained or they were not obtained and they had to leave the area, they just forgot about it. And I don't think so that in the near future we are going to see any help coming from either the UNHCR, which is totally dependent on the member countries' contributions, or the Western NGOs who are now more focused on the Ukraine crisis. Like after the Soviet withdrawal, the attention went to Western Europe. The unification of Germany became more important than dealing with the Afghan refugees or the internal civil war that started in Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal. So I don't think so that we are going to receive any aid or any help in the foreseeable future. Pakistan will have to look after them till such time that the situation in Afghanistan.
But Brigadier Saab, if Pakistan has to look after this huge amount of refugees that it has been hosting since around 4 decades now, what does Pakistan need to do? Already Pakistan is going through a certain crisis of its own when it comes to its economy. It's trying its level best to come out of it. But there is also this additional burden of these millions of Afghan refugees that are here in Pakistan as well. What steps need to be taken?
Pakistan cannot afford to give them citizenship for various reasons, and because it affects the ethnic balance in Pakistan, and for that some of the provinces have huge reservations. Now that is going to create internal instability in Pakistan if Pakistan does that. If you remember, the last Prime Minister Imran Khan had put in a suggestion. There was a very severe backlash on that proposal. So giving them citizenship is not, on at this point in time. Pakistan cannot afford to that because that leads to instability in Pakistan. Now, what we can do is that we can, on one hand, work with the UNHCR how to, help these refugees go back to their country. And how can we work with Afghanistan to ensure that, the conditions in Afghanistan become more stable and become peaceful, and they can provide the job opportunities to the Afghans who are willing to
But
go
Brigadier
back.
Saab, it's very interesting that you talk about the situation in Afghanistan, because as we speak, the way the Taliban are moving forward, whether it not be allowing the women to work under the right circumstances, whether it be the different types of professionals that are literally on the streets, like program anchors, and we've also shared pictures of those in the past as well. Do you feel that Afghanistan can really deal with its own citizens, leave aside those who are in other countries? If the world is not, putting its interest as far as Afghanistan is concerned, until Afghanistan realizes and adheres to what the West has to say and what it wants Afghanistan to do, if the aid does not come to Afghanistan, where does it leave Afghanistan, and where does it leave all the refugees that are still in Pakistan?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's very difficult for Pakistan to convince the present Afghan government that the measures that they are taking, like stopping girls' education, like stopping women from working or stop women from traveling, this is not going to help them. No country in the world will be ready to recognize Afghanistan if they continue with these present policies. Now, do they want to be isolated, or do they make themselves a little more flexible so that, Pakistan can then get around to the world and say that, they have somehow eased on these restrictions that they have placed, unnecessary restrictions that they have placed on women and children, to ease. And when that thing, sort of gains momentum, what can happen is that, the countries can start recognizing Afghanistan. And when Afghanistan starts getting recognition, foreign aid can flow in. And when foreign aid flows in, let me tell you also that if the Taliban have some sense that their country is awash with minerals that are in demand in the world, the most, precious being lithium, in which in southwestern Afghanistan, it's in abundant quantities. There is chromium to be taken. There is iron to be found. There is gas in Afghanistan. Now, all these things will only come up if the Taliban government, which is in Kabul, realizes that, restricting women and putting restrictions on women and children, the girls, 4 or 5 year old girls, to not let them go to school, is not going to work. Do they want to develop a stable Afghanistan, a futuristic Afghanistan in which there is development and people come back to their own country? Not only that people will come back to their own country, you might see Pakistanis going there to find work because skills available in Pakistan may not be available in Afghanistan in an earlier time frame. And if you look at the 2001 onwards, a lot of Pakistani skilled labor did go to Afghanistan and found employment there. Now, if there is a massive economic turnaround in Afghanistan, and which is possible within the possibilities, then Pakistan can also benefit, and these Afghans will also then be willing to go back.
But therein lies a dichotomy, Brigadier Saab, doesn't it? Therein lies a huge question mark when that realization is ultimately going to come to the Afghan Taliban and to the Afghan government. When it comes to the Afghan refugees that are here in Pakistan, I don't see any repatriation happening in the next few years, or maybe in the next few decades or more, because of the current situation in Afghanistan, and also because of the fact that a lot of families that came to Pakistan all those decades ago have now children who have been literally brought up in this country, and they are used to certain luxuries that Pakistan provides that Afghanistan does not provide for the moment. What kind of future do you see? Do you feel that there's going to be an increase as far as Afghan refugees are concerned, more influx of Afghan refugees from Afghanistan in the years to come, or do you feel this is going to become more or less stable as far as our country is concerned?
No, I don't think so. At this point in time, what the Taliban are doing in Afghanistan, that things are going to be stable in Afghanistan. They're not going to be stable. The economic hardships are also going to increase in Afghanistan in the foreseeable future. That's what I see, because of the stubbornness of the Taliban and the irrational policies that they are pursuing. Even they have annoyed a country like Pakistan. The Taliban should have been grateful to Pakistan. They allowed them and their families to stay in Afghanistan while there was an occupation of Afghanistan. But instead of being grateful, they are more of a problem creators for Pakistan at this point in time. Very sorry to say that, but that's what they're doing now. However, as I said before, that if they do come to sense and they do realize that that the future of Afghanistan is in its economic stability and its inclusiveness, that they must include the other communities also within their government must become legitimate. Now they have taken control with the power of the gun. That's how they have captured power. Now this cannot be sustained unless they find some legitimacy. All revolutionary governments, if you look at them, they initially, maybe they come to power through the barrel of the gun, but later on they do find legitimate means to govern the country. There was the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. All these were revolutionary governments in the initial. Castro's government in Cuba, they were all revolutionary governments, but they did find ways and means to become legitimate. And that's what the first thing that the Afghan Taliban government must realize, that they must become a legitimate government first. They must make some sort of a constitution which legitimizes their governance in Afghanistan. And the other communities, apart from the Pashtuns, the other communities realize that they are part of the system. If some communities are out of the system, there will be instability in Afghanistan. The other is when you bring peace and stability to the country and the people become inclusive, they can exploit the economic, the minerals and the economic opportunities. Afghanistan is a hub of the entire region. It can provide regional connectivity. But if they pursue the policies that they are pursuing now, nobody is going to enter Afghanistan. Nobody is going to go there. They may be very good people. I'm not saying that they are, but their whole decision-making process is flawed. Just concentrating. Does Islam only mean women working or women getting educated? Is this Islam? There are so many other facets of Islam that they need to impose in Afghanistan, rather than just being, misogynistic or imposing their, Pashtun way of life on the other communities in Afghanistan.
All right. Speaking a bit beyond Afghanistan, Pakistan, and looking at the global perspective of this refugee problem, whether it be Ukraine, whether it be the Rohingyas, whether it be the Africans who have repatriated, who have immigrated to many other countries, a lot of conflicts exist around the world that leads to people immigrating to other countries one way or the other, legally or illegally. Under the current situation that the world is embroiled in, Brigadier Saab, whether it be Afghanistan, whether it be Myanmar, and I'm talking with respect to Rohingya, whether it be Palestine, whether it be Africa, whether it be Ukraine, do you see all of this going on in the same manner? Do you see this aggravating in the years to come? And if so, what should be the global policy as far as refugees are concerned?
It's very unfortunate, but war has been a very, has been a very important pastime of mankind. They have to fight wars. They have been fighting wars since recorded history, and probably beyond that also they must have been fighting. So fighting is going to be there. Now, how to minimize? You have the United Nations and you have other organizations which do come to forward in such situations to stop wars and to stop genocides and to stop people moving out of their countries. Nobody wants to leave his own country or where he was born or where he wants to live. You just gave the example of the Afghan refugees here. Now, fourth generation here has been born. Now, do you think that fourth generation has got any identity with Afghanistan? No, it doesn't have an identity with Afghanistan. He is more of a Pakistani than he is. But unfortunately, here in Pakistan, he does not have citizenship rights. He doesn't have basic rights. And I've explained why that has happened. And that does not seem to be a solution in the near future, that we grant them citizenship. That is going to create a lot of problems. So we have to live with wars. There will be wars. There will be people displaced. We need more resources in the hands of the UNHCR. More resources to be played at their disposal. They need to expand more because wars are going to continue. So the population of the world is going to grow larger. So refugee problem, whether they are economic migrants or whether they are migrants because of war or famine or so many other things. Water crisis is another thing which is going to come up, and it's going to result in population, shifts. The global warming is coming up. The weather changes that are coming forward, they can result in populations being shifted from a place to another. The deserts are creeping forward. So all these things, the world has to look at it as a world community. We must look at these problems and find solutions. They are very complex problems, but we have to find solutions.
You talk of finding solutions, Brigadier Saab. You talked also of the UNHCR. Now we all know the United Nations depends on the money from donor countries. If the West has the resolve to give the money to the UNHCR, only then will the UNHCR function properly. Do you feel that the West continues or will continue in the coming years to fund a UNHCR, despite the fact that due to Ukraine and due to other issues pertaining the West, it might have its own issues?
The UNHCR has problems because of funding, and unfortunately now, because of the war in Ukraine, it has resulted in recession all over the world. Even the European countries are facing the economic recession. The United States is about to get into an economic recession. The fuel prices have gone up so much that it has now become almost impossible to manage the fuel prices. So we are getting into very difficult times. But then we must rise up. Mankind has the ability to rise up. Now, there is nothing impossible to be done. All it has to be done is that we must put our heads together as a world community. We must put our heads together. Everybody must contribute as per his pocket to the UNHCR and similar other organizations which can come up, which have come up in the region also. We have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These organizations should also, have some organization within them to ensure that, the refugees that are there are helped. For example, Pakistan and Afghanistan and India are now part of the SCO. Now we all contribute towards it, and Pakistan being in the forefront of looking after such a large population, and it will keep increasing. Like I said, in the foreseeable future, this population is likely to go up. The price of a Pakistani visa in Kabul is in thousands of rupees. That's the demand. The other people are trickling in across the border. People do find ways and means. If they don't have the resources to pay for it, then they will find other means to come and trickle into Pakistan. Already, I think Islamabad and all these areas, you see people now, some of them are even now camped in the green areas of Afghanistan as refugees. So something has to be done. We just cannot leave it like that.
True. Something needs to be done, and you need to, come up with collective reasoning and procedures and methodologies in order to alleviate the present condition of situations that lead to people going out of their home countries and becoming refugees. Thank you so very much, Brigadier Retired Saad Mohammed Saab, to have joined us and to have talked to us about the World Refugee Day today. Of course, as we all know, this day is celebrated to honor the courage, strength and determination of those people who change their home grounds to go to another country as refugees and are forced to flee their homeland under the threat of persecution, conflict and violence. Let's hope the world realizes that and does not go towards situations that results in an increase in such crisis, such as the influx of refugees in other countries. Let's come to our last two stories very, very quickly. The first contains and concerns COVID-19. We've talked about it many a times in the past as well. And in the last few weeks, we had seen more or less a lull as far as the COVID cases are concerned. But now we are again seeing a slight increase as far as the number of cases across Pakistan are concerned. The National Institute of Health has warned that the number of cases are increasing, the percentage of cases are increasing. 16.67% in Hyderabad, 10.08% in Karachi, Islamabad 2.27%, Lahore 1%, Mirpur Azad Kashmir 5.26%, Mardan 3.39%, Ahmedabad 1.2%. So the cases are increasing. What needs to be done? I've already been talking about it right so many times. We need to follow the SOPs, wear our mask whenever we are in crowded places, avoid as much of the crowded places as possible. We are going to have Eid al-Azha in a couple of weeks' time. We need to be very careful when we go and buy the sacrificial animals in the big mandis, in the big places, and follow the SOPs, and also, of course, keep washing your hands with soap or with sanitizer. That's extremely important. Keep wearing the masks as well. That is all I can say. We need to collectively resolve to take these steps in order to curtail the spread of COVID-19. And finally, let's go to Sri Lanka. We all know that Sri Lanka has defaulted. We know that it is facing the worst economic crisis since it became independent in 1948. Nevertheless, Sri Lanka's military has opened fire to contain rioting at a fuel station. This has happened very recently. Unprecedented queues for petrol and diesel have been seen across the bankrupt countries. A lot of people want petrol. There's not enough. There's not enough for the country to move forward. And so, to contain the public, the military had to fire. This has resulted in 4 civilians and 3 soldiers wounded. And this is going to result in further casualties, further issues in the coming days. Sri Lanka is grappled with a huge economic crisis, and it's an example for many others to be vigilant of on how to move forward as far as their economy is concerned. We wish Sri Lanka all the best. We've been very good friends in the last few decades. We've also helped Sri Lanka come out of its militancy and extremism crisis with the Tamil Tigers. So we really hope that Sri Lanka grapples with this crisis and the IMF helps it in the right time so that it does not go from bad to worse as a situation that we are currently observing. With that, we come to an end of today's newsroom. We'll see you inshallah tomorrow with news story segments that pertain to us. You and Pakistan, stay safe and follow the SOPs. That's all I can say at the end. Allah Hafiz.